At some point, money stopped being a means and became the destination itself. It stopped serving life and started organizing all of it. The hours of the day, career choices, even the way two people decide whether it's worth staying together. Why does an entire society with more accumulated wealth than any previous generation ever had keep producing so many people who are anxious, exhausted, feeling like it's never enough? Why does the next achievement promise relief and deliver only a brief one, followed by an emptiness almost identical to the one before, just a little deeper? This isn't a new question. It runs through entire generations who grew up learning that the next paycheck, the next promotion, the next purchase would finally solve the emptiness once and for all. One man understood this machinery before almost anyone else, decades ago, and described with exact precision a symptom that still repeats itself today. His name was Erich Fromm. Fromm was born in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century, into a strict Jewish family, and spent his life trying to answer a single question. Why do free human beings repeatedly choose to drown themselves in things that don't nourish them? He wasn't an economist. He was a psychoanalyst, trained in the Freudian tradition, but uneasy with its limits. He was part of the Frankfurt School, a group of thinkers who combined psychoanalysis with social criticism to understand why entire societies get sick together. Fromm looked at money not as a matter of accounting, but as a symptom, a sign that something, in the way we organize life, had been traded for a cheap substitute. That's the trade we're going to unpack here, slowly, without rushing, because it explains an emptiness you've probably felt before and never quite managed to name. Before we get into the concepts, it's worth understanding why a psychoanalyst, trained to listen to dreams and individual traumas, decided to turn his gaze toward the entire structure of society. Fromm lived through the rise of an authoritarian regime in Germany up close. He watched neighbors, colleagues, ordinary and reasonable people embrace an ideology of mass domination that marked him in a way no individual diagnosis could explain on its own. He realized it was necessary to understand the collective character of an era, the type of personality that a given economic and social organization tends to produce on a large scale. And it was by following that thread that he arrived at money, consumption, and work as central pieces of the same psychological puzzle. In one of his most widely read books, To Have or To Be, published in 1976, near the end of his life, Fromm proposes a simple division, but one that changes everything once you take it seriously. There are two fundamental ways of being alive. One is the having mode. The other is the being mode. In the having mode, you relate to the world through possession. You don't live an experience, you own it. You don't take a trip. You have a trip, stored in photos, as proof you were there. You don't build knowledge. You have a diploma. You don't feel a relationship. You have a partner, the way you have a car parked in the garage. In the being mode, on the other hand, life happens through activity, through presence, through direct encounter with what is real. You don't store the experience, you live it while it lasts, and it keeps existing inside you afterward, without needing physical proof to be real. Think of a simple everyday example. Two people watch the same sunset. One of them pulls out her phone, takes a photo, posts it, and spends the rest of the moment checking how many people like the picture. The other keeps his phone in his pocket and simply watches the light change color until it disappears. Both were in the same place. Only one of them, in fact, was actually there. The first turned the moment into possession, an image to be displayed later. The second lived the moment as an experience, without needing to turn it into anything beyond what it already was. The same pattern repeats itself in contexts far more common than a rare sunset. Someone reading a book can read it in two radically different ways, according to Fromm. They can read it in the having mode, worried about memorizing quotes to bring up later, about collecting the title like an intellectual trophy, about finishing quickly just to add one more item to that year's reading list. Or they can read it in the being mode, letting the ideas genuinely move through their thinking, pausing when a sentence calls for it, allowing the content to transform, even quietly, the way they see their own life after closing the book. The object is the same. It's the relationship with it that completely changes the internal outcome of that experience. The problem, according to Fromm, is that modern society organized almost everything around the first mode. Work, school, relationships, leisure, all of it got converted into a logic of accumulation. You don't study to understand the world. You study to have a resume. You don't work to create something. You work to have a paycheck. You don't rest to recover energy. You rest to have more productivity afterward. Having swallowed being, and most people never even noticed the exact moment it happened, because it was gradual, generation after generation. Like a river that changes course so slowly no one notices until the other side has dried up. This explains a feeling a lot of people carry without knowing how to name it. Never being fully present in their own life. You're at family dinner, but thinking about the credit card bill arriving by email at the end of the month. You're at the birthday party of someone you love, but checking your phone because of a work notification. You're lying in bed, exhausted, but unable to shut off your mind from tomorrow's to-do list. Life keeps passing by while you manage it, as if it were a project that needs to be run rather than lived. Fromm went beyond the simple observation about possession and presence. In another book called Man for Himself, he describes a specific type of personality that modern economics produces on a massive scale, the market personality. In this orientation, the person starts to see herself as a commodity. She needs to have exchange value, she needs to be sellable. And what determines that value isn't who she is on the inside, but how she's perceived from the outside. Resume, appearance, followers, job title. All of it becomes packaging that has to be constantly updated to stay competitive in the marketplace. Notice the subtle shift in the question this produces. The question stops being who am I and becomes how much am I worth? And worse, worth to whom? You start living for the sake of an imaginary buyer, an invisible market that's always evaluating you, always ready to discard whatever no longer has any use. This creates a background anxiety that never switches off because market value is inherently unstable. It rises and falls like any other financial asset, and the sense of personal worth for someone living inside that logic rises and falls right along with it, day after day, depending on how many messages come in, how many offers show up, how much recognition is on offer. Fromm describes other character orientations in the same book as a counterpoint to the market personality, and it's worth getting to know at least one of them, because it shows that a real alternative exists, not just a complaint. He calls it the productive orientation, the type of character that relates to the world through its own capacity to create, reason, love, and work with authenticity, without depending on outside approval to validate those capacities. A person with this orientation still takes part in the market, still needs to earn a living, still negotiates salary and provides services. The difference isn't about leaving the system, which is nearly impossible for most people, but about not letting market value become the only available ruler for self-worth. She knows how to separate the price of a specific skill, set by that moment's supply and demand, from the value of her existence as a whole, which isn't set by any outside quotation. That distinction sounds subtle, but in practice, it changes the entire body of anyone who manages to sustain it. Someone trapped in the market personality feels every rejection, every lost deal, every weaker month of revenue as a direct attack on their own identity. Someone who has managed to develop some productive orientation feels that same financial loss as what it is, an unpleasant external event, without letting that event rewrite their sense of who they are on the inside. The difference isn't indifference to money, it's a refusal to let money occupy a position it was never meant to hold. Notice the side effect of this in everyday language. People started talking about themselves as if they were talking about products. I have to sell myself well in this interview. I need to build my personal brand. I'm investing in myself. All of this language, which sounds natural today, would have seemed strange 2 or 3 generations ago. It reveals just how far market logic has invaded territory that used to belong only to identity, to existence, to the simple fact of being alive, without having to justify it through productivity. To understand why we fall so easily into this market logic, and why we resist it so little. Fromm wrote one of the most important books of the 20th century on social psychology, called Escape from Freedom, published in 1941, at a moment of intense political instability in Europe. The book's central question was unsettling. Why do free people, with the real possibility of thinking and choosing for themselves, so often prefer to give up that freedom and hand themselves over to some authority, ideology, or routine that thinks for them? Fromm's answer is that modern freedom came with a price too high for many people to carry alone. For centuries, human beings lived bound to fixed structures, a social role defined by birth, a religion that supplied ready-made meaning, a small community that guaranteed automatic belonging, no effort of choice required. It was a prison, yes, but a prison that also protected, because no one had to invent alone a meaning for their own existence. When those structures began to crumble, especially from modernity onward, the individual gained something extraordinary, the freedom to decide who to be. Except no one warned that this freedom would come bundled with loneliness, uncertainty, and the crushing responsibility of building meaning from scratch, alone, with no manual, with no guarantee of getting it right. Faced with that weight, Fromm describes a few escape mechanisms that human beings develop to flee the anguish of freedom. One is what he calls automaton conformity. The person abandons her own thoughts and starts repeating, without question, whatever the majority thinks, wears, buys, defends. Not because she genuinely agrees, deep down, after reflecting on it, but because thinking for yourself hurts. It's more comfortable to dissolve into a group than to sustain the solitude of a genuinely personal opinion. This applies to consumer choices. It applies to positions adopted without reflection. It applies to virtually any area where you see people repeating ready-made phrases just to belong to some tribe, without ever having actually examined whether they agree with it. Fromm describes in the same book 2 other escape mechanisms besides automaton conformity, and both help explain phenomena that go far beyond consumption, even though they connect to it. One is what he calls authoritarianism, which shows up both as submission and as domination. Faced with the anguish of deciding alone, some people surrender completely to an external authority, a strong leader, a rigid ideology, a system of rules that takes the weight of individual choice off their hands. Others, going the opposite way, seek to dominate and control the people around them, as a way to feel, once again, a sense of power that modern freedom seemed to have dissolved. The third mechanism is destructiveness, an impulse to eliminate whatever threatens or disturbs, whether by destroying someone else or by destroying oneself through quiet self-destructive behaviors spread out over years that erode health and relationships without any single dramatic gesture that draws attention. All 3 mechanisms, automaton conformity, authoritarianism, and destructiveness, are different attempts to resolve the same pain. The unbearable responsibility of being free, of having to build meaning with no ready-made recipe. Money and consumption step right into that gap opened up by the fear of freedom. They offer an immediate sense of control in a world that seems too chaotic to be controlled any other way. Buying something new gives a quick illusion of decision-making power, of agency over your own life. For an instant, you're not a person lost inside some enormous system. You're someone who chose, who had the power to acquire. It's an anesthetic. It works for a little while, and then it demands the next dose, a slightly bigger one, to produce the same effect. And this desire to consume, it's important to say, doesn't spring up spontaneously inside you. It's manufactured with engineering-grade precision. The thinkers of the Frankfurt School, Fromm included, paid close attention to how advertising and mass media don't exactly sell products. They sell identity. They sell the promise of belonging, of status, of being noticed, of finally being enough. The object itself is just the vehicle. What's really being sold is a feeling that, by acquiring that thing, you become someone more complete, more accepted, more secure in your own skin. It's a structural logic of the market that needs to keep desire perpetually unsatisfied, because a satisfied desire doesn't buy again, and an entire economy depends on that renewed dissatisfaction, season after season. There's a point here that tends to go unnoticed. The more a person lives inside this market logic, the less able she is to tell apart what she truly wants from what she was taught to want. The two things blend together until they seem identical. She believes, with total sincerity, that she wants that object, that upgrade, that specific trip, without realizing that this desire was carefully cultivated in her over the years through thousands of repeated stimuli. That doesn't mean every desire is fake. It means it's worth stopping once in a while to ask, is this desire mine, or was it planted in me? Understanding philosophy is interesting. Practicing philosophy can change your life. Start with the link I left in the pinned first comment. Let's turn now to territory Fromm handled with rare delicacy. Love. In The Art of Loving, published in 1956, he defends an idea that sounds simple but hits home deeply once you pay attention to your own language. Have you noticed how we talk about relationships? My girlfriend, my boyfriend, my conquest. The verb have shows up constantly, as if the other person were an acquired property, something you own and can lose, instead of a living relationship that needs to be practiced every single day, almost like a musical instrument that goes out of tune if no one takes care of it. Fromm insists that loving isn't a passive feeling that simply happens to you, like a lucky ticket you win by chance. Loving is an active practice. It demands discipline, care, attention, ongoing effort, the same way any other art, like playing an instrument or painting, demands repetition and dedication to be done well. And it's precisely because it takes so much work that the culture of having prefers to simplify love into conquest. It's easier to think of love as something you win, keep, and show off in a couple photo than as something you cultivate quietly, with no audience, every single day, often without any outside recognition at all. One of the most cited points from The Art of Loving is the distinction Fromm draws between falling in love and truly loving. Falling in love for him is relatively easy because it involves the sudden collapse of a barrier between two previously separate people, an intense sense of merging that anyone can feel with no effort at all, almost like a happy accident. Truly loving, over time, is an entirely different task because the barrier has already fallen, the novelty has already passed, and what's left is the repeated choice to keep caring, to keep paying attention to someone who, over time, becomes too familiar to produce that same initial ecstasy. This is exactly the point where the culture of having tends to abandon the relationship, chasing a new passion that reproduces the original intensity, instead of investing in the quieter, less glamorous work of loving someone you already know well. The same mindset that turns people into commodities in the job market turns partners into trophies inside relationships. Notice how certain conversations about relationships sound today, almost like investment evaluations. He's a good catch. She's out of my league. I scored an upgrade. That economic language applied to affection isn't an accident. It's the same structural market logic, now seeping into territory that should be the opposite of calculation, the territory of a genuine encounter between two people. Both phenomena, the commodification of work and the commodification of love, come from the same root: the inability to relate to what is alive without trying to control it, own it, or somehow monetize it. This logic of having also swallowed up work, perhaps even more completely. Fromm picks up a concept from Marx, alienation, to explain something most people feel in their bodies, even without knowing the exact name for it. Historically, human work was a form of expression. Someone who built a piece of furniture could see their own reasoning, their creativity, their personal mark right there in the finished piece, from start to finish of the process. Today, for most people, work has lost that direct connection to who they are. You step into a role, carry out fragmented tasks, often without understanding the final result of what you're helping produce, without ever seeing the complete object come to life from your own hands, and the only thread left connecting you to that daily effort is the paycheck that lands in your account at the end of the month. That means money stopped being a consequence of work and became the only possible meaning of it. You don't work because it expresses something of yours. You work to sustain a level of consumption that in turn tries to fill the void left precisely by work that has no meaning. It's a closed loop, almost perfect in its trap. Empty work generates a need for compensation. The compensation comes through consumption. Consumption demands more money. More money demands more empty work. No one stops to ask whether this machinery, at the end of the day, delivers anything that truly matters, because the rhythm of the machinery never leaves room for that question to breathe. Picture an ordinary day inside that machinery. The alarm goes off before the body is ready to wake up. The commute eats up an hour, sometimes two, on a packed bus or stuck in traffic. Time that belongs to no one, not to the employer and not to the person herself. Time simply lost between one point and another. At work, most of the tasks are fragmented, repetitive, disconnected from any visible result the person could point to at the end of the day and say, "I built that." By night, the exhaustion isn't the kind that rest can fix, because it isn't physical fatigue from real effort. It's boredom disguised as busyness. And the comfort, almost always, comes from some form of quick consumption, a small purchase, a show watched without really paying attention, an endless scroll through content that leaves no memory at all the next day. That day repeats itself, with small variations, for decades, and the paycheck at the end of the month is the only proof that it actually happened. Fromm wasn't alone in pointing out this hollowing out of work. Centuries before him, within very different philosophical traditions, a similar distrust already existed toward the idea that material accumulation, on its own, could produce a good life. The Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived between the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, argued that most human desires were artificial, created by culture, and that true tranquility came from satisfying simple, natural needs, not from the endless accumulation of goods that the surrounding society considered desirable. The distinction Epicurus drew between natural and necessary desires, natural but unnecessary desires, and empty desires, created only by vanity and social comparison, echoes almost identically in the distinction Fromm would draw, more than 2,000 years later, between the mode of being and the mode of having. The wrapping changes, the vocabulary changes, but the core intuition runs through history practically intact. Unlimited accumulation has never, in any era, been the proven path to a life worth living. There's a distinction Fromm makes that helps explain why this machinery never truly satisfies. He separates pleasure from happiness. Pleasure is quick, immediate, tied to outside stimuli. A new purchase, a like, a meal, a compliment received in passing. Pleasure rises fast and falls fast, demanding constant refills, each time in slightly larger doses to produce the same effect as before. Happiness, for Fromm, is an entirely different category. It's a more lasting state, tied to growth, to productive activity, to the feeling of being fully alive while doing something meaningful, even if that something earns no applause at all. Money, for all its power, is extraordinarily efficient at buying pleasure and completely incapable of buying happiness. That's why so many people pile up material achievements and still feel like something's missing. It's not ingratitude, and it's not a character flaw. It's that this person is trying to solve a happiness equation using only pleasure currency, and the math never adds up, no matter how many coins get poured into the attempt. This observation of Fromm's, drawn from clinical work and social reading, found an echo decades later in behavioral economics research he never got to see. In 1974, economist Richard Easterlin published a study that became known as the Easterlin paradox. Comparing countries and historical periods, he found that although average income grew over the decades, the average reported level of happiness didn't keep pace with that growth, remaining nearly stagnant generation after generation. Easterlin's finding was about a historical trend. More collective wealth over time didn't produce more collective satisfaction with life. Decades later, in 2010, researchers Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton, both winners of the economics prize given in memory of Alfred Nobel, examined the question from a different, more immediate angle. Not the trend across years, but day-to-day emotional well-being, measured among thousands of people in the United States. They found something more specific than Easterlin: a concrete ceiling, sitting at a certain range of annual income, above which daily emotional well-being practically stopped rising, even as a person's wealth kept growing well beyond that point. One study showed the stagnation over time. The other pointed to the ceiling within a single moment. Together, the two findings arrive at the same conclusion by different routes. Money genuinely and effectively solves the problems that a lack of money creates. But past a certain point, it simply stops delivering proportional emotional return, exactly as Fromm had already sensed decades earlier, without needing a single spreadsheet to see it. This economic discovery doesn't invalidate the pursuit of stability, far from it. It simply confirms, with data, what philosophy had already noticed from a different angle. There's a real ceiling to what money can deliver, and most modern dissatisfaction doesn't live below that ceiling. It lives above it, in the illusion that just a bit more, always just a bit more, will finally solve something that never actually had anything to do with the account balance. There's another line of research that speaks directly to Fromm, even though it was born within academic psychology decades after him. American psychologist Tim Kasser devoted a large part of his career to studying what he called materialistic values, the tendency to organize your life around wealth, image, and status as central goals. In his research, gathered mainly in the book The High Price of Materialism, published in the early 2000s, Kasser found a consistent pattern. People who placed material goals at the center of their own identity reported, on average, lower levels of well-being, more anxiety, and more fragile interpersonal relationships than people who organized their lives around goals tied to personal growth, community, and emotional bonds. This isn't chance or an isolated statistical coincidence. The pattern repeated across different countries and cultures. It's as if empirical research, decades after Fromm described this logic of possession and accumulation that he named the having mode, had found, with methodology and numbers, exactly the mechanism he had already described through clinical work and social observation. There's a concept of Fromm's, presented in one of his densest books, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, published in 1973, that shed light on this issue in a way that still makes people uncomfortable when they first encounter it. He describes two opposite orientations within human character. One is necrophilia, understood here not in the narrow clinical sense of the word, but as a deep attraction to everything mechanical, controllable, predictable, dead. The other is biophilia, the love of everything that is alive, spontaneous, unpredictable, in constant growth and change. A person dominated by the necrophilous orientation prefers the object to the encounter, prefers control to spontaneity, prefers accumulating fixed things to taking a risk on living experiences that can't be predicted or fully mastered. And money, along with everything it buys, fits that preference perfectly. Money is stable, within certain limits. Money doesn't change moods, doesn't disappoint the same unpredictable way a person disappoints, doesn't demand emotional reciprocity or patience on hard days. A living relationship can hurt you deeply. A bank account can't. That's why, when someone chooses to invest all their emotional energy into accumulating wealth and neglects relationships, creativity, and presence with the people they love, that person is, in practice, choosing the dead over the living, even without consciously realizing they're making that choice every day, in small decisions that seem harmless in isolation. It's uncomfortable to recognize this because the surrounding culture rewards exactly this behavior. Whoever accumulates is admired, called an example, called someone who made it. Whoever prioritizes presence over productivity is often seen as someone lacking ambition, as someone who got left behind while everyone else kept running. The social yardstick is calibrated, almost invisibly, to reward the necrophilous orientation and to view biophilia as naivety, as the immaturity of someone who hasn't yet understood how the world really works. It's worth opening a historical parenthesis here, because it helps show that this manufacturing of desire isn't some recent accident of the digital age. It has roots and a name. In the early 20th century, a nephew of Freud's named Edward Bernays applied psychoanalytic concepts to the world of advertising and public relations in the United States. Bernays understood, before almost anyone else, that products didn't need to be sold on practical usefulness. They could be sold on the unconscious desire they stirred up, on the identity they promised to build for whoever bought them. He ran campaigns linking cigarettes to women's liberation and cars to personal status, decades before any social network existed. The mechanism Fromm described as the artificial manufacturing of need was, therefore, already being applied deliberately and skillfully long before the internet. And the difference today isn't the mechanism itself, it's only the speed and scale at which it operates, present on a screen that most people carry inside their own pocket, connected all day long. This also helps explain why resisting this kind of manufactured desire takes more than individual willpower. It isn't a personal weakness in people who overconsume. It's a system built with decades of professional refinement, specifically to bypass rationality and aim directly at the unconscious desire for belonging and status. Knowing this doesn't solve the problem on its own, but it does lift an unnecessary layer of guilt. The difficulty you feel resisting compulsive consumption isn't a lack of character. It's the expected outcome of a system designed, with a great deal of technical skill, to produce exactly that outcome. It's also worth noting that this mechanism doesn't operate only on material objects. Over the last 2 decades, it has expanded into territory that once seemed protected, the experience of life itself. Trips, meals, moments of leisure, all of it has also come to be packaged as a status product, needing to be displayed, compared, and externally validated before it can even be fully felt by the person living it. Someone can stand in front of a genuinely breathtaking landscape and still feel a pang of anxiety if the photo doesn't come out good enough to share, as if the experience only becomes complete once it receives someone else's approval. Fromm never got to see this specific stage of the phenomenon he described, but the internal logic is exactly the same one he identified decades earlier. The experience stops being valuable on its own terms and starts being valuable for what it can be converted into, turned into displayable proof of a life that looks good from the outside, even if it remains empty on the inside. If you've made it this far, you may have already felt, at some point in the last few minutes, a small pang of recognition. Hold on to that feeling, because it's exactly the material Fromm used to build his most precise analyses, and we'll come back to it later, when we talk about what to do with that discomfort, instead of just feeling it and moving on as if nothing had been touched. Let's pause on a specific point, because it tends to be the moment when these ideas stop being theory and become a mirror. Think of someone you know, or maybe it's you, who worked for years to reach real financial stability, owning a home, a comfortable bank balance, some breathing room in the budget at the end of the month, the ability to buy things without calculating every cent. And even so, the anxiety stayed. The emptiness didn't leave once the financial goal was finally hit. It just changed shape. Put on new clothes. Maybe now it's insomnia at 3 in the morning. Maybe it's a diffuse irritation with no clear cause. Maybe it's that feeling of always chasing something without quite knowing what that something is. Fromm would explain this phenomenon in a direct way. Having never resolves an existential question, because the root of the problem was never the lack of money. The root lies in a deeper disconnection from the very meaning of being alive. Money only postpones that question. It buys time, distraction, temporary comfort, a reasonably effective anesthetic. But the question stays there, waiting, patient, and it always comes back, usually in the quiet moments the routine can no longer fill, on a free Sunday afternoon, or on a night when the body is tired, but the mind insists on staying awake. This isn't just an individual problem. Fromm argued something that still sounds radical to a lot of people. Entire societies can become psychologically ill, the same way a person can. And when an entire society shares the same sick pattern, it stops looking like illness and starts looking like normalcy, the expected backdrop of adult life. Without pointing to any specific political system, you can observe something structural. When an economy is organized primarily around profit, and human well-being becomes a secondary, almost accidental consequence of that goal, it's natural for anxiety, constant competition, and a sense of emotional scarcity to become part of the ordinary functioning of that society. People then look at each other, see everyone anxious, exhausted, running from one obligation to the next, and conclude that this must just be how adult life works, with no possible alternative. Where are you watching this video from right now? Write in the comments the city, the country, the place where you are while you listen to this. It's worth noticing how many different places these ideas reach, because that shows something Fromm firmly believed. This emptiness isn't an isolated problem of one specific culture. It's a pattern that crosses entire borders, wherever that same structural market logic takes hold. It's worth lingering a bit more on this idea of a sick society, because it tends to trigger initial resistance. It's more comfortable to think of psychological suffering as something strictly individual, a matter of brain chemistry, personal history, wrong choices made by each person alone. Fromm doesn't deny those dimensions, but he insists there's a layer that comes before all of them, the social and economic environment within which each individual tries, with whatever tools they have, to build a life that makes sense. If that environment systematically rewards competition over cooperation, accumulation over connection, appearance over authenticity, it's expected that most people within it will develop to some degree the same symptoms. Chronic anxiety, a constant feeling of never being enough, a genuine difficulty resting without guilt. Calling this an individual weakness is conveniently blind, and it benefits whoever profits from keeping the machinery turning exactly as it is, unquestioned. This doesn't mean the person is exempt from any responsibility for their own life. That would be an exaggeration in the opposite direction, just as dangerous. It just means that understanding the structural origin of your own exhaustion lifts an unnecessary weight. You're not broken for feeling that emptiness. You're reacting in an expected and understandable way to an environment designed to produce exactly that feeling as permanent fuel to keep the machinery of consumption and endless productivity spinning. One promise that props up much of this machinery is the promise of security. We work, we save, we invest, all in the name of some future feeling of financial security. And there's nothing wrong with seeking material stability. That's a legitimate basic need. No one should romanticize precariousness. The problem, according to Fromm, comes up when money becomes the only foundation on which a person builds their sense of inner security. Because money is, by nature, external and unstable. It depends on the market, on employment, on health, on luck, on factors largely outside individual control. A sense of security built entirely on something unstable is never real security. It's just a well-funded illusion, one that can collapse with a layoff, a crisis, any unexpected event nobody saw coming. The security that truly holds a person up, for Fromm, comes from somewhere else, harder to reach, but far more stable once you get there. It comes from a mature relationship with yourself. It comes from the ability to tolerate uncertainty without needing to control everything around you at all times. It comes from knowing, with some inner clarity, that your own worth doesn't disappear if your bank account takes a hit some bad month. It's a security that doesn't depend on external factors, and that's exactly why it's the only kind that can't be taken from you by an economic crisis, an unexpected layoff, or any twist the outside world decides to throw at you. This doesn't mean denying the practical importance of money, and it's worth stressing that point, because it's easy to misread this part of the reflection. No one supports a family on inner serenity alone. No rent gets paid with self-knowledge. Fromm was never naive enough to suggest that. What he's pointing to is a matter of hierarchy, not exclusion. Someone who has, as far as possible, taken care of their basic material needs and still feels anxious and empty doesn't need more money to fix that specific emptiness. They need to investigate what exactly they're trying to compensate for through accumulation. Because the answer is rarely found in the next number on the bank statement. It's found in some other area of life that got forgotten while all the available energy went into work and consumption. After all this long reconstruction of the problem, the inevitable question is, so what do we do with this, in practice, outside of theory? Fromm never proposed abandoning money, living in some extreme way, or romanticizing poverty as if it were a virtue. That would just be trading one rigid prison for another. His proposal is more subtle, and precisely because of that, much harder to sustain day to day. Take money out of the center of life and give it back the place it should have always occupied, that of a means, never an end in itself. In practice, that means redirecting energy toward activities that belong to that more active, more present way of existing, what Fromm called the mode of being. Caring for someone without thinking about what you get back, without calculating the return. Creating something, even something small, just for the pleasure of the process, without needing to monetize every hobby in your life. Loving actively, practicing presence instead of collecting proof of possession, instead of treating the other person like a trophy sitting on a shelf. Thinking deeply about your own existence, instead of filling every available silence with one more screen, one more stimulus, one more conveniently available distraction in your pocket. None of these actions earn instant likes or bump up the bank balance at the end of the month, but they're exactly what produces the thing money has never managed to buy. The feeling of being alive while you're living, instead of just managing your own existence from a distance, like someone watching their own life from outside, through a screen. Fromm also talked about the importance of concentration as a practice almost forgotten by modern life. Not concentration in the sense of productivity, of focus to get more done at work, but concentration as the ability to be fully present in one single thing at a time, without the mind fragmented across 10 simultaneous stimuli. He observed, back when he wrote this, decades before smartphones even existed, that people were losing the ability to do one thing at a time, eating without reading anything at the same time, talking without checking the clock, resting without feeling the immediate need to fill that empty space with some distraction. Today, with a screen available inside your pocket at all times, that fragmentation has become so common, it's no longer even noticed as a problem. It's just the expected backdrop of any moment of the day. Recovering the ability to concentrate fully, even for just a few minutes a day, is one of the most concrete and accessible ways to practice the mode of being without needing any radical life change. It's a slow process with no magic formula, no foolproof 5 steps promised by some online course. It involves relearning how to tolerate moments with no stimulus, no purchase, no distraction, and discovering that within that silence, there's still something of yours, something that doesn't depend on approval or consumption to keep existing. It involves choosing, over and over, across years, presence instead of possession, even when possession seems safer and much easier to measure, to show off, to compare against what everyone else has piled up too. Remember that pang of recognition I asked you to hold on to a little while ago? It comes back now with more force, because this is exactly the part where the theory demands a real choice. You don't have to change everything today, but maybe it's worth choosing a single area of your life, just one, where this imbalance between having and being is most obvious, and trying just for this week to flip the logic there. Trade a purchase for a conversation. Trade an endless scroll for 10 minutes of real silence. Small enough not to change your whole life at once, big enough to start noticing the difference between the two ways of being alive. Fromm called this gradual shift the process of individuation, a term he partly inherited from the psychoanalytic tradition, but gave his own shape to. Individuating, in this sense, doesn't mean isolating yourself from others or abandoning real responsibilities, like paying bills or supporting a family. It means no longer acting on pure social autopilot, on unconscious repetition of whatever everyone around you does, and instead acting from your own evaluation, even if that evaluation, in the end, arrives at conclusions similar to the majority's. The difference isn't necessarily in the outcome of the choice, it's in where the choice comes from. Buying a house because, after honestly reflecting on it, you concluded that it makes sense for your life is very different from buying that same house just because it's the next expected step, silently demanded by everyone around you, never genuinely questioned. This process almost always requires going through a period of discomfort, because questioning automatic habits pulls out the floor of certainties that had been holding up your routine until then. It's common to feel, somewhere in the middle of that path, a kind of vertigo, the sense of no longer knowing exactly what you want, after realizing that a good part of what looked like your own desire was actually a borrowed script. Fromm saw that vertigo as a sign of progress, not a sign of failure. It's the moment when a person stops operating on the autopilot of the market personality and starts, even if stumbling, building a more honest relationship with their own existence, without depending entirely on other people's approval to feel like they're on the right path. There's no safe shortcut through that vertigo, and any promise of a quick fix for it should raise immediate suspicion, including from anyone talking about philosophy in an internet video. Fromm himself insisted that genuine growth doesn't move at a pace compatible with the speed of modern life. It happens in layers, with setbacks, with days when the person slides back into their usual autopilot, and other days when they manage, for a few hours, to live more present and less calculated. The realistic goal isn't to reach some permanent state of enlightenment about your own consumption. That would just be another version of the same perfectionist trap. The goal is to gradually increase the proportion of moments lived in that state of full presence, knowing that the logic of having will never fully disappear, because it's woven into the very economic structures within which any person has to survive. So we come back to the question that opened this video. Why, with so much, is so much still missing? Fromm's answer, after decades studying the human mind and the societies it builds, is disarmingly simple to state and immensely hard to live, because money will never be able to give life meaning. Meaning isn't something you own, something you keep in an account or show off as an achievement for others to see. Meaning is something you live, moment by moment, through presence, through creation, through care genuinely given to another person, through the courage to be fully present in what you do, even with no guarantee at all of any return. So here's a question to take with you after this video, with no rush to answer it now, maybe not even today. In which areas of your life are you having instead of being? Where did you trade presence for possession without realizing over the years that you were making that trade? Maybe the answer won't come today or tomorrow, but the simple act of asking yourself that, honestly, is already, according to Fromm, a real first step back toward the mode of being. It's worth remembering, finally, that Fromm wrote all of this decades ago, on a typewriter, with no internet, no social media, no algorithm-targeted advertising, and even so, he managed to anticipate, with remarkable precision, the exact kind of emptiness that still tightens the chest of people who have, objectively, far more material comfort than he ever had in his lifetime. That says something important about the nature of the problem we're discussing here. At its core, it was never about the quantity of things available. It was always about the relationship established with those things, and about the place a person allows, or doesn't allow, money to occupy within their own existence. Fromm wrote all of this without ever promising an easy path or a 7-step formula for a full life. He himself recognized that living in the mode of being, inside a society entirely organized around having, is almost an act of quiet resistance, practiced day after day, with no applause, no visible proof of progress, no guarantee at all of external reward. Maybe that's exactly why his ideas are still being read, decades after they were written, in an era he never even got to know, with screens he could never have imagined. Because the problem he described wasn't tied to one specific era. It was about the way all of modernity decided to organize the relationship between human beings and what they produce, own, and desire. And as long as that organization stays in place, the question that opened this video will keep being worth asking, again and again, by every new generation that grows up believing that the next financial milestone will finally, once and for all, silence the emptiness. If these ideas made sense to you, drop a like, because it helps this video reach more people who need to hear this today too. Subscribe to the channel, because every week we bring reflections like this one, based on real thinkers, with no filler and no empty promise of an instant fix. And if you want to go beyond the video to engage with these ideas directly in practice, consider joining our membership club, a space for people who don't just want to watch, but actually want to live this philosophy day to day, a little at a time.